Sarah tightened the last red ribbon around a small golden tray, her wrinkled fingers trembling slightly from the cold. She paused for a moment to adjust her glasses on her face, feeling the weight of age in her hands that once were so strong. The snow was falling outside, covering the street with a soft, silent blanket, while the lights of the houses blinked in harmony, like a silent Christmas choir. But that night, something seemed out of place. It wasn't the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg filling Sarah's kitchen, nor the distant jingling of church bells. It was the house next door, always so dark, always so quiet. She leaned against the edge of the sink, looking out the living room window, gently drying her hands on her apron decorated with small embroidered pine trees. Outside, she could see Mr. Miller's old gray wooden house, its windows closed and roof tiles covered in snow. It was as if the house, like its owner, had given up the fight against time. "I know what it's like to be alone," Sarah murmured, feeling that familiar pang in her chest. She knew that loneliness. Ever since she lost Joe, her partner for nearly 5 decades, the silence had become a constant visitor. At first, she fought it. She turned on the TV, kept the radio on all day. But then, she simply accepted it. Still, there was something that kept her going. Her kitchen. Among the old recipe books, filled with notes and flour stains, Sarah had found a refuge. There, amidst pots and memories, she discovered that the recipes Joe loved so much could warm more than her heart. They could reignite happy memories. Maybe he just needs a gesture, she thought. Something small. A reason to open that door. Sarah picked up the tray with the gingerbread cookies she had baked earlier. They were perfectly decorated, each one with glossy icing she painted with steady hands despite the pain in her joints. A shy smile formed on her lips. If there was one thing she knew how to do well, it was putting love into every dish. Carefully, she put on her heavy coat, the same one Joe had bought for her on Christmas in 1994, and wrapped a wool scarf around her neck. Each movement was a little slower, each step carrying the weight of the years, but Sarah refused to be discouraged. The snow crunched under her feet as she crossed the garden and approached Mr. Miller's door. The cold wind made her cheeks burn and turned her nose a nearly childish red. She stopped in front of the door, took a deep breath, and knocked 3 times. For a moment, the sound echoed as if it were the only living thing on that street. No response. Nothing but the wind playing with the dry branches of the trees. Sarah was about to turn away, thinking it might be better to try another day, when the door creaked open, just a crack. Mr. Miller's eyes appeared, surrounded by deep wrinkles and an expression of weariness that seemed to carry decades of pain. "Yes," he said, his voice rough and cold. "Mr. Miller." "Hello," Sarah said, struggling to smile despite the cold look she was receiving. "I brought something for you. I thought you might like it." He looked at the tray, then at Sarah, as if trying to decipher her intentions. Finally, he answered in a dry tone, "I don't need anything, but thank you." Before Sarah could say anything else, the door slowly, but firmly, shut. She stood there for a moment, her heart tight. It wasn't just rejection. It was something deeper, a barrier she recognized from afar. It was pain, raw and buried, that turned people into shadows of themselves. On her way back home, with empty hands and a heavy heart, she wondered if she had done enough. Could a tray of cookies really reach someone who seemed so distant from everything? Or was it better to just give up? But as she took off her coat, a thought crossed her mind, clear as the sound of bells in the distance. Giving up was never part of the Christmas spirit, and at that moment, Sarah decided that Mr. Miller would have a Christmas to remember, whether he wanted it or not. Sarah was back in her kitchen, the place where she still felt capable of creating something meaningful, even when the world outside seemed frozen. The sweet aroma of freshly baked bread filled every corner of the small space. The mix of cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves was like a balm, bringing to mind scenes from other Christmases, happier times. She approached the table with slow steps, carrying the weight of her 76 years in every movement. Her hands, marked by time with small stains and stiff joints, gently touched the recipe book resting there, as if it were a treasure. The worn leather cover had visible cracks, and the pages were yellowed, stained with grease and sugar. They were marks of a lifetime. Sarah opened the book and smiled when she saw her mother's unmistakable handwriting. It was firm and elegant, just like the woman Sarah had always admired. She ran her trembling fingers over the title on the first page, O'Connell Family Recipes. Just looking at those words brought back the sound of laughter around the dinner table from her childhood. "How many Christmases did we spend around this table?" she murmured, her voice filled with nostalgia. She remembered how her parents' house would be filled at this time of year, with siblings and cousins running through the halls and the smell of pies baking in the oven. Her mother used to say that each dish carried a story and that Christmas was the time to tell those stories through flavors. She let out a heavy sigh, returning to the present. The dining room in her house was equally cozy, but now silent. The old wooden table was still there, covered with a hand-embroidered linen tablecloth, a wedding gift from more than 50 years ago. In the center, a set of red candles waited patiently to be lit. Around it, decorated porcelain plates, carefully taken out of the cupboard only at this time of year, were ready for a dinner that might have no guests. Sarah knew something was missing. It wasn't just Joe's absence, though she felt that as an open wound. It wasn't just the emptiness left by her children, who were far away, busy with their own lives. It was the lack of a reason, someone to share what she still had to give. Because, despite the back pain and sleepless nights, Sarah felt there was still something inside her that needed to be shared. She thought about Mr. Miller, the reclusive neighbor, with his house always dark and his words always so few. He intrigued her. What could have made a man like him give up on living the spirit of Christmas? Sarah didn't know what kept him away, but she felt that, in some way, she understood. After all, she too knew the pain that made people invisible to their own eyes. He needs a gesture, she whispered to herself. Something that shows he still matters. Determined, Sarah flipped through the book until she found the page she was looking for. She stopped at a recipe marked with a piece of golden ribbon, Christmas spice bread. It was one of her mother's favorites, and later became Joe's too. A simple bread, but one that filled the air with the scent of Christmas magic. As she gathered the ingredients, Sarah began to murmur, "This is what I'm going to make for him. Not something flashy, but something that touches the heart. Because, sometimes, all we need is a little piece of the past to remind us that we can still feel the warmth of the present." She placed the flour in a large bowl and began to knead the dough with careful hands. The movement was slow, but rhythmic, almost like a dance with her memories. With every press of the dough, she felt as if she were shaping not just a loaf of bread, but an opportunity. The recipe book lay open beside her, and Sarah couldn't help but smile as she read her mother's instructions. Put love into every fold of the dough. The flavor will always be in the one who makes it, not just in what's made. The oven began to hum softly, and the warmth took over the kitchen, pushing away the cold that still lingered in the house. Sarah leaned back in her chair, with the bread ready to bake and a sense of anticipation growing inside her. "Let's see if he can resist this," she said, smiling to herself as the first scents began to spread. She looked at the wall clock, whose hand ticked slowly. Time passed more slowly for her now, but it didn't seem to matter. Sarah knew her mission wasn't quick, nor easy, but something inside her told her it would be worth it. And as she waited for the bread to bake, she allowed herself to be carried away by the memories and the sincere desire to bring a little light to that dark house next door. The sound of the timer echoed through the kitchen, pulling Sarah out of her thoughts. She stood up carefully, feeling the slight discomfort in her joints as she pushed the chair back. Every movement now required more from her, but she didn't let that stop her. When she opened the oven door, she was greeted by a wave of heat and the unmistakable aroma of the spice bread, a comforting blend of cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. "Ah, it's perfect," she murmured, leaning in to observe the golden crust. With a satisfied smile, she took the bread out and placed it on the cooling rack. Even though she was alone, Sarah made sure to prepare every detail with care, not for herself, but for the meaning that gesture carried. The kitchen was silent, except for the soft hum of the oven and the distant sound of the wind outside. Sarah walked over to the window and pulled the curtain aside. The snow continued to fall, covering the street with an even thicker layer. The garden looked like a Christmas card, But Mr. Miller's house remained the same, dark, lonely, and impenetrable. She placed one hand on the windowsill and stood there for a while. There was no movement inside. No lights, no sounds, nothing that suggested anyone was celebrating Christmas. It was as if that place had been forgotten by time. He's given up on everything, Sarah thought, feeling a pang in her heart. But she quickly pushed the thought away. I've been where he is, she murmured to herself. The memory of her own lonely Christmases, right after Joe's death, suddenly surfaced like an unexpected wave. At that time, she too had closed her curtains and avoided the festivities. The world seemed to have moved on while she was left behind, trapped in her pain. But she also knew that small gestures could make all the difference. She remembered an afternoon when her neighbor, Nancy, had left a still warm apple pie on her porch. That day, Sarah didn't open the door to thank her, but she ate every bite of the pie while crying. It was the first sign, however small, that the world wasn't as empty as it had seemed. Maybe he just needs a gesture like that, she said aloud, trying to convince herself. Determined, Sarah took a special plate from the cupboard, a white porcelain one with golden details. It was part of a set she and Joe had bought on their first Christmas after getting married. She held the plate for a moment, observing the reflection of the kitchen light on its flawless surface. Today's a good day to take it out of the cupboard, she said with a small smile. She placed the spice bread in the center of the plate and carefully wrapped it in a white cloth embroidered with delicate golden stars. Then, she tied a red ribbon around it, making sure the gift looked as beautiful as it was special. For her, every detail mattered. It was the way to show that this wasn't just bread. It was a gesture of affection, a symbol that he wasn't alone. When everything was ready, Sarah looked at the plate in her hands and, for a moment, felt a pang of doubt. Will he accept it this time? Or will he reject me again? She took a deep breath, trying to push away the negative thoughts. It wasn't about his reaction, she reminded herself. It was about the effort, about the gesture itself. She put on her heavy coat, the same one she had worn for years, and wrapped the wool scarf around her neck. Her gloves, a bit worn, barely protected her hands from the cold, but Sarah ignored them. With the plate securely in her hands, she opened the door and stepped out. The snow was deeper now, almost covering her ankles. The cold wind blew against her face, but she pressed on, step by step, carefully balancing the gift. When she reached Mr. Miller's door, she hesitated for a moment. The silence there felt heavier, almost oppressive, as if that place carried the weight of years of isolation. Sarah looked at the plate one more time and, with a small sigh, raised her hand and gently knocked on the door. The wait seemed endless. The cold began to seep into her clothes, and she almost considered giving up when, finally, the sound of footsteps on the other side made her hold her breath. The door creaked open just a crack, revealing Mr. Miller's face. He looked even more worn than before, with deep dark circles under his eyes and a tired expression. His gaze quickly shifted from Sarah to the plate she was holding. I brought something different this time, Sarah said, struggling to smile. It's a spice bread, an old recipe from my mother. I thought you might like it. Mr. Miller didn't respond immediately. His eyes, which had once seemed so cold, now showed something different, hesitation, perhaps even curiosity. You didn't have to, he finally said, his voice rough and low. I know I didn't have to, Sarah replied softly, but I wanted to. Because no one should spend Christmas alone. For a moment, Mr. Miller stood still, holding the door with more force, as if fighting something inside himself. Then, almost reluctantly, he extended his hand and took the plate. His fingers brushed Sarah's for a brief second, and she felt his skin cold as the snow surrounding them. Thank you, he murmured, before closing the door again. But this time, without haste. As Sarah walked back home, she felt her heart a little lighter. The cold wind still hit her face, but it didn't seem as cold as before. She didn't know if she had made a real difference, but something inside her told her that this small gesture was the beginning of something bigger. The sound of the timer echoed through the kitchen, pulling Sarah out of her thoughts. She stood up carefully, feeling the slight discomfort in her joints as she pushed the chair back. Every movement now required more from her, but she didn't let that stop her. When she opened the oven door, she was greeted by a wave of heat and the unmistakable aroma of the spice bread, a comforting blend of cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. "Ah, it's perfect," she murmured, leaning in to observe the golden crust. With a satisfied smile, she took the bread out and placed it on the cooling rack. Even though she was alone, Sarah made sure to prepare every detail with care, not for herself, but for the meaning that gesture carried. The kitchen was silent, except for the soft hum of the oven and the distant sound of the wind outside. Sarah walked over to the window and pulled the curtain aside. The snow continued to fall, covering the street with an even thicker layer. The garden looked like a Christmas card, but Mr. Miller's house remained the same, dark, lonely, and impenetrable. She placed one hand on the windowsill and stood there for a while. There was no movement inside. No lights, no sounds, nothing that suggested anyone was celebrating Christmas. It was as if that place had been forgotten by time. "He's given up on everything," Sarah thought, feeling a pang in her heart. But she quickly pushed the thought away. "I've been where he is," she murmured to herself. The memory of her own lonely Christmases, right after Joe's death, suddenly surfaced like an unexpected wave. At that time, she too had closed her curtains and avoided the festivities. The world seemed to have moved on while she was left behind, trapped in her pain. But she also knew that small gestures could make all the difference. She remembered an afternoon when her neighbor, Nancy, had left a still warm apple pie on her porch. That day, Sarah didn't open the door to thank her, but she ate every bite of the pie while crying. It was the first sign, however small, that the world wasn't as empty as it had seemed. "Maybe he just needs a gesture like that," she said aloud, trying to convince herself. Determined, Sarah took a special plate from the cupboard, a white porcelain one with golden details. It was part of a set she and Joe had bought on their first Christmas after getting married. She held the plate for a moment, observing the reflection of the kitchen light on its flawless surface. "Today's a good day to take it out of the cupboard," she said with a small smile. She placed the spice bread in the center of the plate and carefully wrapped it in a white cloth embroidered with delicate golden stars. Then, she tied a red ribbon around it, making sure the gift looked as beautiful as it was special. For her, every detail mattered. It was the way to show that this wasn't just bread. It was a gesture of affection, a symbol that he wasn't alone. When everything was ready, Sarah looked at the plate in her hands and, for a moment, felt a pang of doubt. Will he accept it this time? Or will he reject me again? She took a deep breath, trying to push away the negative thoughts. It wasn't about his reaction, she reminded herself. It was about the effort, about the gesture itself. She put on her heavy coat, the same one she had worn for years, and wrapped the wool scarf around her neck. Her gloves, a bit worn, barely protected her hands from the cold, but Sarah ignored them. With the plate securely in her hands, she opened the door and stepped out. The snow was deeper now, almost covering her ankles. The cold wind blew against her face, but she pressed on, step by step, carefully balancing the gift. When she reached Mr. Miller's door, she hesitated for a moment. The silence there felt heavier, almost oppressive, as if that place carried the weight of years of isolation. Sarah looked at the plate one more time and, with a small sigh, raised her hand and gently knocked on the door. The wait seemed endless. The cold began to seep into her clothes, and she almost considered giving up when, finally, the sound of footsteps on the other side made her hold her breath. The door creaked open just a crack, revealing Mr. Miller's face. He looked even more worn than before, with deep dark circles under his eyes and a tired expression. His gaze quickly shifted from Sarah to the plate she was holding. I brought something different this time," Sarah said, struggling to smile. "It's a spice bread, an old recipe from my mother. I thought you might like it." Mr. Miller didn't respond immediately. His eyes, which had once seemed so cold, now showed something different, hesitation, perhaps even curiosity. "You didn't have to," he finally said, his voice rough and low. "I know I didn't have to," Sarah replied softly, "but I wanted to, because no one should spend Christmas alone." For a moment, Mr. Miller stood still, holding the door with more force, as if fighting something inside himself. Then, almost reluctantly, he extended his hand and took the plate. His fingers brushed Sarah's for a brief second, and she felt his skin cold as the snow surrounding them. "Thank you," he murmured, before closing the door again. But this time, without haste. As Sarah walked back home, she felt her heart a little lighter. The cold wind still hit her face, but it didn't seem as cold as before. She didn't know if she had made a real difference, but something inside her told her that this small gesture was the beginning of something bigger. Back in the kitchen, Sarah carefully hung her coat on the chair near the door. The cold was still on her cheeks, and her hands, even protected by gloves, seemed to take longer to warm up. She passed her palms over the kettle on the stove, which still held some of the heat from the boiling water hours earlier. For a moment, she stayed there, absorbing the warmth that filled her small kitchen. The table was immaculate as always, decorated with a cream linen cloth she only used at Christmas. In the center, a simple arrangement of pine branches, a few pine cones painted gold, and 3 red candles. They had not yet been lit. Why light candles for herself? Sarah did these things for others, and with Joe gone, sometimes she forgot that she, too, deserved these small pleasures. She looked around. The kitchen was just the way she liked it, full of stories. Every corner held something that made her remember happy moments. On the shelf above the sink were small ceramics her grandchildren had painted during past Christmas visits. The most special was a crooked yellow star, made by the oldest, Jack, who was now in college. Sitting carefully at the table, Sarah took off her glasses to clean them on the edge of her apron. She felt strangely light, as if she had just completed an important task. Her heart still raced a little when she remembered the moment at Mr. Miller's door, the hesitant look, his hand briefly touching hers when he took the plate. She wondered what he might be doing now. Had he put the bread on the table? Had he already tried it? She imagined the scent of cinnamon and cloves filling the dark house, mixing with memories that, who knows, he might have forgotten were still there. He looked so tired, Sarah murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. She knew what it was like to carry the weight of loneliness. She knew how a house could become heavy when it was inhabited only by memories. She thought of Joe, always so cheerful, so full of life, especially at Christmas. He was the one who insisted on decorating the tree with colorful lights, even when Sarah preferred something more sober. He was the one who made jokes at the table and always sang off-key when the grandchildren asked for Christmas songs. Sarah turned her head toward the corner of the kitchen, where a picture frame rested on a wooden table. She picked up the object carefully and ran her fingers over the glass. It was an old photo from a Christmas in 1974. She and Joe were sitting side by side, in front of a Christmas tree that seemed overly full of ornaments. She was holding a plate of gingerbread cookies, while he pretended to steal one. "You knew how to bring joy to any place, Joe," she said, her voice slightly trembling. Closing her eyes for a moment, Sarah let the memories envelop her. It wasn't sadness she felt, but a deep and serene longing, a gratitude for the moments she had lived, mixed with the wish that she could still share them with someone. Her thoughts returned to Mr. Miller. Why had he accepted the bread? Was it hunger? Courtesy? Or maybe he just needed a simple gesture to remind him that the world could still be good? Maybe that's what Christmas does, she thought, as she placed the picture frame back in its place. It gives us a chance to remember what really matters. Sarah looked at the open recipe book on the table, still showing the page for the spice bread. With a decisive movement, she flipped through the pages, stopping at one that seemed perfect for the occasion. Caramelized nut pie. It was a special recipe. Her mother only made it on very important occasions, and Sarah had learned to prepare it with the same careful instructions. She read the notes in the margins, written by her mother with a faded blue pen. "Remember, the secret is patience with the caramel. If he liked the bread," Sarah murmured, "who knows what a good pie could do?" She stood up with renewed purpose, her movements firmer as she gathered the ingredients on the counter. As she kneaded the dough for the crust, her thoughts went back and forth, alternating between the present and the past. Every ingredient had a story. Every movement in the kitchen felt charged with meaning. The sugar melted slowly in the pan, transforming into a golden, thick caramel. Sarah stirred with a wooden spoon carefully, her eyes fixed on the bubbling liquid. The kitchen began to fill with a sweet and deep aroma, enveloping everything around her. When the pie finally came out of the oven, glistening with caramel covering the toasted nuts, Sarah felt a wave of satisfaction. It wasn't just a pie, it was a message, a continuation of the gesture that had started earlier. She sat down again, now with a hot cup of tea between her hands, and looked at the clock. It was still early to return to Mr. Miller's house, but she knew she would. There was no rush. Christmas was still far from over, and Sarah had a goal: to show that sometimes a simple gesture, a plate of bread or a slice of pie, could open doors that had remained closed for a long time. The afternoon was slowly bidding farewell, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and pink. Sarah looked out the kitchen window as she carefully wrapped the pie in an embroidered cloth, the same one her mother used for special occasions. There was something comforting in repeating these familiar gestures, a silent connection with the women who came before her, who also used their hands to care for others. As she adjusted the red ribbon holding the fabric, a doubt whispered in her mind. What if he doesn't open the door this time? Sarah shook the thought away with a small headshake, but the feeling lingered. She clearly remembered Mr. Miller's tired expression earlier. He seemed to be struggling with himself, as if each word was drawn from a place of resistance. As much as he had accepted the bread, that didn't mean Sarah had completely broken the barriers isolating him. Maybe he doesn't trust people, she thought, her gaze lost in the pie resting on the table. Or maybe he just forgot what it's like to be cared for by someone. As she reflected, the phone rang, breaking the silence. Sarah walked to the phone in the living room, passing through the hallway decorated with simple garlands. The ring sounded strange in the quiet house, almost like an intrusion. She answered in a soft voice. "Hello? Aunt Sarah." It was the cheerful voice of her niece Jenny, who always called to check in on her. "How's Christmas over there? Is it really cold?" Sarah smiled upon hearing the familiar voice. "Cold enough to freeze my thoughts, dear. What about you? How are things?" Jenny began to talk about the preparations for dinner with her family, but soon changed her tone, noticing something in Sarah's voice. "You're alone again this year, aren't you?" "Oh, not exactly," Sarah replied, trying to sound carefree. "I've got someone nearby who might need me more than I expected." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Jenny responded. "It's your neighbor, right? Mr. Miller?" Sarah smiled, surprised by her niece's insight. "Yes, that's him. I made him some bread earlier, and he actually accepted it. Can you believe that? Now I'm thinking of bringing him a pie. But I don't know, Jenny. He seems so closed off, so lost." "Aunt," Jenny began, with an encouraging tone, "you always say Christmas is about doing what we can, even when we don't know what the outcome will be. It's about showing we care, remember?" Sarah chuckled softly. "You sound exactly like your mother now. She used to love reminding me of the things I said." They chatted for a few more minutes, and when they hung up, Sarah felt renewed. Jenny was right. It didn't matter what happened. The gesture itself was what really held value. She returned to the kitchen and picked up the plate with the pie, now well wrapped. She put on her heavy coat, scarf, and gloves, and stepped out into the evening that was already beginning to fall. This time, the snow seemed deeper, making her steps more difficult. The icy wind cut across her face, and Sarah had to tighten the scarf around her neck to protect herself. Each movement was slower, and the weight of age made itself felt with every step. Still, she moved forward with determination. When she reached Mr. Miller's door, she stopped for a moment to catch her breath. The house seemed even darker now, with the daylight fading away. She pressed the plate against her chest, as if seeking comfort in what she carried. Carefully, she knocked on the door. Once, twice, 3 times. This time, the sound of footsteps took longer to arrive. Sarah almost believed he wouldn't open the door, but finally, she heard the creak of feet on the wooden floor. The door slowly opened, revealing Mr. Miller's face. He looked even more worn than before, the weight of something invisible resting on his shoulders. His eyes met Sarah's, and for a moment, no one said anything. "Good evening, Mr. Miller," Sarah began, her voice gentle but firm. "I made a pie today. It's a special recipe from my mother, something she only made on important occasions." He looked at the wrapped pie, then at Sarah, and finally sighed. I don't know what to say." "Just say you'll try a piece," Sarah replied, with a smile that asked for nothing in return. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something more, but instead, he carefully took the plate, as if it were something precious. "Thank you," he whispered, almost inaudible. Sarah hesitated before turning to walk back home. Something in his expression seemed different from earlier that morning, a mix of surprise and confusion, as if he didn't understand why someone cared for him. As she crossed the snow back toward her house, Sarah felt something new within her. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a beginning. Perhaps, deep down, Mr. Miller had started to remember that there were still people who cared, and that was enough for Sarah. The door closed softly behind Mr. Miller, and Sarah stood in the snow for a few more seconds, as if waiting to hear something. Perhaps the sound of footsteps inside the house, or maybe the noise of plates being set on the table. But nothing came. The silence remained heavy, only interrupted by the rustling of the wind through the dry branches of the trees. With a slight sigh, she tightened her scarf around her neck and turned toward home. The walk felt longer now. Each step required effort against the snow that had piled up around her ankles. The cold wind bit at her cheeks, but Sarah was too lost in her thoughts to notice the discomfort. Inside her kitchen, the warmth of the space seemed to envelop her like a blanket. She took off her coat and gloves, hanging them carefully. While rubbing her hands to warm them, she glanced at the table, where only the crumbs from the gingerbread she had cut for herself earlier remained. She sat slowly, allowing the weight of the moment to settle around her. Something about her interaction with Mr. Miller that night left her unsettled. On one hand, he had accepted the pie a step forward, no doubt. But on the other, there was something in his eyes, something that seemed to resist, even as his hands took the plate. It was as if he carried an inner battle that Sarah couldn't fully understand. As her thoughts wandered, her eyes landed on the recipe book still open on the counter. She slowly stood up, picking it up carefully. Flipping through it, the yellowed pages filled with handwritten notes seemed to speak to her, each recipe telling a story. She stopped at a specific page, gingerbread cookies with icing. It was one of the first recipes her mother had taught her, and Sarah knew every step by heart. The smell of the cookies baking always seemed to fill the house with a joy that no other dish could replicate. As she ran her fingers over the carefully written words, Sarah felt something stir inside her. Maybe Mr. Miller needed more than just a pie or a loaf of bread. Maybe he needed something that brought more life, more color, something that didn't just warm the stomach, but also rekindle memories, even those he preferred to keep buried. She began gathering the ingredients on the counter, her hands moving with the same precision as always. Each step of the recipe was like a ritual, sifting the flour, measuring the spices carefully, mixing the butter until the dough reached the perfect texture. As she worked, the kitchen transformed. The aroma of ginger and cinnamon filled the space, and the warmth from the oven created a cozy atmosphere. Sarah wasn't just baking cookies, she was creating a message, an invitation to something bigger than words could express. When the cookies finally came out of the oven, she patiently waited for them to cool before starting to decorate them. She grabbed the piping bag and, with careful hands, drew small snowflakes and hearts on each one. It was delicate work, but Sarah did it with a calm concentration, as if she were conversing with someone through each stroke. After finishing, she placed the cookies in a metal tin decorated with Christmas scenes, a sled, reindeer, and a small cabin surrounded by snow. The tin was a little old, but still beautiful, and Sarah thought it would be the perfect container for the gift. She carefully closed the lid, feeling a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. The clock on the wall showed 8 o'clock. There was still time to make one last attempt on this Christmas Eve. Grabbing her coat again, Sarah felt the weight of the day on her shoulders, but also something more, a determination that pushed her forward. As she walked through the snow once more, the tin of cookies firmly in her hands, Sarah thought about how small things had the power to create change. When she arrived at Mr. Miller's door, hesitation reached her. What if he didn't want to open this time? What if he had already regretted accepting the pie? But before she could give in to doubt, she knocked on the door. The sound was lighter now, as if it carried less urgency, but still conveyed a clear intention. This time, the door opened more quickly. Mr. Miller appeared, still with the same tired look, but something in him seemed less closed off. His eyes landed on the tin Sarah was holding. "I thought you might like this," she said with a smile. "Gingerbread cookies. A recipe my mother made every Christmas." For a moment, he didn't respond. His eyes seemed to absorb the tin in her hands, as if he were trying to decide what it meant. Then, to Sarah's surprise, he took a step back and opened the door a little more. "Would you like to come in?" he asked, his voice low and hesitant. Sarah felt her heart race, but kept her calm. "Sure, if it's not a bother." As she entered, she noticed that the house was as cold and silent as it had seemed from the outside. But there was something else there, something she couldn't quite define. Mr. Miller took the tin from her hands and placed it on the living room table, still without saying much. When he turned to her, there was a glimmer in his eyes that Sarah hadn't seen before. Something small, but real. "It's been a long time since anyone cared like this," he said, breaking the silence. And in that moment, Sarah knew her gesture had started to make a difference. The air inside Mr. Miller's house was cold, as if the walls had forgotten what it was like to hold warmth. Sarah took a few hesitant steps inside, her gaze carefully scanning the room. The lights were dim, almost non-existent. A lamp in the corner of the room cast a yellowish light that barely illuminated the old furniture. There was a worn armchair near a small, unlit fireplace and a cluttered coffee table with newspapers stacked on top of each other. "You can sit down, if you want," Mr. Miller said, pointing to the armchair next to his. His voice had a neutral tone, but the invitation, no matter how simple, carried something special, a first step that Sarah didn't intend to waste. She slowly removed her coat, folding it over her arm, before sitting in the armchair, which creaked lightly under her weight. The tin of cookies was still on the table, closed. Mr. Miller settled into the armchair next to hers, his hands resting on his knees as if he didn't know what to do with them. "Thank you for letting me in," Sarah said with a light smile. "I wasn't sure if you'd want the company." He let out a small sigh, looking down for a moment before responding. "It's just been a while, you know. Since I had company." Sarah nodded, respecting the silence that followed. She understood the weight of those words. She knew that sometimes it wasn't the loneliness itself that hurt, but the absence of voices, of laughter, or even the small interruptions people bring to each other. "I know that feeling too," Sarah finally said, her voice calm. "After Joe passed, it was hard to get used to. Well, this kind of silence." Mr. Miller raised his eyes to her, surprised by her honesty. He fell silent, but Sarah could feel that her words had touched something inside him. "How long ago was he gone?" he asked, hesitantly. 6 years, Sarah replied, with a slight smile that carried both pain and acceptance. "But sometimes it feels like it was yesterday, or a lifetime ago. Depends on the day." Mr. Miller nodded, and for a moment, his eyes seemed lost in a distant thought. Sarah didn't want to press him. There was something in his expression that told her he, too, carried stories that weren't easy to share. As the silence filled the space between them, Sarah pointed to the tin of cookies on the table. "May I open it?" Mr. Miller looked at the tin as if he had completely forgotten about it. "Sure," he said, with a small nod. Sarah opened the tin carefully, revealing the delicately decorated cookies. The scent of ginger and cinnamon escaped, filling the air with a warmth that contrasted with the coldness of the house. "My mother used to say that cookies like these were magical," Sarah said, picking up one of the cookies. She believed that when someone made them with love, they could open even the most stubborn heart. Mr. Miller let out a small laugh, the kind of sound that almost seemed forgotten, strange when it came out for the first time in a long while. "Well, I don't know if I'm that stubborn," he replied, with a hint of humor in his voice. Sarah smiled, offering one of the cookies to him. "Don't take it the wrong way, but I think that's exactly what my mother would have said." He took the cookie with hesitant fingers, as if handling something fragile. He studied it for a moment before taking a bite. The silence that followed felt lighter, as if the weight in the air had lessened just a little. "It's good," he said, after chewing. "I don't remember the last time I ate something like this." Sarah leaned slightly forward. "My mother also believed Christmas was about these things. Small gestures, small memories. They stay with us, even when we think we've forgotten them." Mr. Miller remained silent for a moment, but Sarah could see something in his eyes, a vulnerability that had been hidden before. He cleared his throat before speaking again. "My wife used to make cookies like this," he finally said, his voice almost a whisper. "Actually, she made them every year. For the neighbors, for the friends. For me." Sarah didn't interrupt. She knew these words came from a deep place, and each of them was a small act of courage. "After she passed, I couldn't do any of this anymore," he continued, looking at his hands. "It was easier to shut the door. Pretend that there were no more Christmases." The confession hung in the air, and Sarah felt her own eyes fill with tears. But instead of responding immediately, she just nodded, giving him the safe space she was creating for him. "I understand," she finally said. "But you know, Mr. Miller, sometimes Christmas finds a way to come back to us, even when we're not ready for it." He looked at her, surprised by the simplicity of her words. As the two of them sat there, sharing the moment with cookies and unspoken stories, something began to shift. It wasn't big or dramatic, but it was real, a thread of connection, something that said that maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to face the world alone. The soft light from the lamp and the aroma of the cookies created a stark contrast with the cold emptiness that had once seemed to dominate the house. Sarah watched Mr. Miller, who remained seated in front of her, holding the last piece of the cookie between his fingers as if it weighed more than it truly did. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "Christmas used to be the best time of the year for me. For us." The word "us" hung in the air, heavy with stories he hadn't yet shared. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her gaze full of patience and genuine interest. It wasn't curiosity that moved her, but a desire to alleviate, even if just a little, the burden that seemed to suffocate him. "My wife, Ellie," he continued, his voice low and uneven. "She loved Christmas. She planned every detail, from the lights on the porch to the desserts she insisted on making weeks in advance. Our house would be full of friends, full of music, full of life." He let out a small laugh, but the sound was bitter. And then, one day, everything changed. Sarah knew what was coming. Not the details, but the weight of the loss behind his words. The same weight she carried since Joe had passed. "It was Christmas Eve," he said, his voice now almost a whisper. "An accident. Coming back from one of those parties she loved so much. I stayed home that night. I was too tired to go. And she never came back." He cleared his throat, but his hand trembled slightly. Sarah didn't say anything. She let the silence fill the space, offering a refuge for him to continue if he wanted. "After that, I didn't see the point in any of it. I packed away the lights, donated the decorations. I didn't even look at her recipe book. It was easier that way. Easier not to feel." Sarah leaned in a little more, her hands resting in her lap. "I know how it is," she said, her voice heavy with empathy. "After I lost Joe, there were days when it felt impossible to even get out of bed. Every little detail, everything reminded me of him. The smell of coffee in the morning, the sound of the chair creaking when he sat at the table." Mr. Miller raised his eyes to her, surprised by the frankness in her words. "But you know," Sarah continued, with a small smile, "I found that sometimes, what hurts the most can also be what helps us move forward. It was his recipes, the ones he loved, that brought me back. Making the fruitcake, baking the cookies, it was as if, in some way, he was still with me. Not the way I wanted, but the way I needed." He fell silent, processing her words. Sarah noticed a glimmer of vulnerability in his eyes, as if something was beginning to shift. "And that's what Christmas means to me now," Sarah said, her voice gaining a soft firmness. "It's not about parties or presents. It's about remembering that even when we lose someone, we can still create something good, something that warms our hearts and, maybe, someone else's heart too." Mr. Miller lowered his head, holding the last piece of the cookie. "I thought I was protecting her memory by avoiding all this. But, in reality, I was hiding. From myself. And maybe, from her too." Sarah felt her eyes welling up, but she held back the tears. She knew this moment wasn't about her. It was about him, about the beginning of a transformation that only he could choose. "Ellie wouldn't have liked this, you know," he continued, now with a tone of regret in his voice. She would hate to see me like this, hiding in this house, refusing even a piece of bread made with love. Sarah smiled softly. I'm sure she'd be very proud of you for opening the door tonight. It may seem like a small thing, but opening the door is always the beginning. He let out a heavy sigh, but there was something different in him now, a lightness that hadn't been there before. The clock on the wall marked nearly 9 o'clock. The night continued, and the snow outside seemed to have stopped falling, leaving the world wrapped in a serene silence. Can I tell you something? Sarah asked, slightly changing her tone. He nodded, curious. The next time I bake cookies, I think I'll need some help. My hands aren't as steady as they used to be, and I admit decorating these was a challenge. Mr. Miller raised an eyebrow, a small smile forming at the corner of his lips. Are you inviting me to be your kitchen assistant? I'm inviting you to remember what it's like to create something with your own hands, Sarah replied. Something that brings joy, even if it's just for a moment. His smile grew, though still shy. I think I can consider that. The two shared a moment of silent understanding, and for the first time, Sarah felt that his heart was beginning to open, even if slowly. When Sarah returned home that night, the world seemed calmer, as if the universe itself were holding its breath. The wind, which had once been biting, had ceased, leaving the snow resting gently on the ground. Still, the cold lingered, and Sarah felt the impact of it as she entered her cozy kitchen. The contrast between the welcoming warmth of her home and the cold emptiness of Mr. Miller's house was still fresh in her mind. She carefully took off her coat, hanging it on the chair, and walked over to the table. The red candles were still burning with steady flames, casting a warm light on the cream linen tablecloth. Sarah sat slowly, watching the candles dance in silence. The kitchen was quiet, but for the first time in a long time, that silence didn't feel so heavy. As she rested her chin in her hands, her thoughts returned to Mr. Miller. His words echoed in her mind. Christmas used to be the best time of the year for me. For us. Sarah knew exactly the weight of including another person in that us. It was like reliving a piece of a life that felt so distant, yet still present in the details, in the memories time couldn't erase. She was lost in these thoughts when the doorbell rang, breaking the silence with an unexpected urgency. Sarah lifted her head, surprised. At this hour? It wasn't common for anyone to show up so late, especially on such a cold night. Struggling slightly to get up, she pulled her scarf tighter around her shoulders before walking to the door. When she opened it, she was surprised to find Mr. Miller standing there, snow covering his shoulders, holding the tin of cookies she had brought earlier in his hands. He looked hesitant, as if battling something inside himself. Mr. Miller, Sarah said, blinking quickly to disguise her shock. Is everything okay? He held the tin as if it weighed a ton, looking away for a moment before responding. I thought I'd return this, he began, his voice low, almost muffled. But I can't do it without saying something first. Sarah tilted her head slightly, intrigued, but she didn't interrupt. His face, illuminated by the soft light from the kitchen, seemed more vulnerable than before. When you left, he said, looking at the tin, I left it on the table for hours. I didn't open it right away. Not because I didn't want to try, but because those cookies reminded me of her, of Ellie. Sarah felt her heart tighten, hearing his wife's name for the first time. She used to make cookies like this, he continued, now looking directly at Sarah. Every Christmas. It wasn't just about the taste, it was about what they meant. It was her way of saying that she cared, even if it was just for the neighbors who hardly ever spoke to us. He paused, swallowing hard. Sarah noticed his hands trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from emotion. And when I finally ate one of them, he cleared his throat, trying to find the words. It was like I could hear her laughing in the kitchen again. It was good. It hurt, but it was good. And I realized something. Sarah remained still, her gaze fixed on his, waiting for him to finish. I realized that maybe, he continued, I wasn't protecting her memory by shutting everything out. I was betraying who she was. Ellie never ran from anything. She faced life, even when it was hard. And I just hid. Those words, so sincere and painful, pierced Sarah's heart like an echo of her own struggles. She knew exactly what it was like to try to protect yourself from the pain, only to discover that, in reality, you were depriving yourself of the love and connection that could still exist. "Mr. Miller," she began, her voice low but firm, "I think Ellie would be very proud of you. I know it must have been difficult to open that door today, but that, in itself, is already a victory." He smiled almost imperceptibly, looking at the tin. "Maybe, but there's one more thing." "Yes?" He raised his eyes, now with a gleam she hadn't seen before. "I wanted to ask, do you think you could ever teach me how to make cookies like this? I have no idea where to start, but I think it's something I'd like to try." Sarah felt her heart warm. It wasn't just a request to learn a recipe. It was a declaration that he was ready to start over, even if just little by little. "Oh, Mr. Miller," she replied, with a genuine smile. "I'd be honored. But I should warn you, I'm quite particular when it comes to frosting." He chuckled softly, a sound that seemed strange but genuine, as if he were rediscovering something forgotten. "Good to know," he said, tilting his head. "I was never good at decorating, but I think I can learn." They sat in silence for a moment, but it was a different silence, filled with understanding. The snow fell again outside, covering the world in a blanket of peace. "Thank you," Mr. Miller finally said, his voice firmer now, "for not giving up." "I'm not very good at giving up," Sarah replied, with a playful gleam in her eyes. As she watched Mr. Miller walk back to his house, Sarah felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just him who was starting over. She was too. The loneliness she had carried since Joe's passing now seemed less final, as if the connection with another soul had the power to fill even the deepest voids. Carefully closing the door, Sarah looked at the tin in her hands. This small object, so simple, now symbolized something bigger. The power of Christmas to reignite memories, open hearts, and, above all, remind us that it's never too late to find warmth in the world again. The next morning arrived quietly, with snow piled up on the windowsill in Sarah's kitchen. She woke up early, as usual, but there was something different about that morning. When she opened the curtains, she saw the world covered in pristine white, as if the night before had erased the traces of the past and made room for new beginnings. Placing the kettle on the stove, Sarah began her morning routine. She was preparing the tea when something outside the window caught her attention. A figure was standing in her front yard. Mr. Miller. He was there, wearing a thick coat and a hat that looked like it had been pulled from the back of a closet. His shoulders were slightly hunched, but he held something in his hands, wrapped in a faded blue cloth. Sarah opened the door with curiosity and a hint of concern. "Mr. Miller?" she said, pulling the scarf tighter around her neck as the morning breeze enveloped her. "Is everything okay?" He took a small step forward, hesitant, and lifted the bundle. I thought I'd bring something for you this time." Sarah blinked, surprised. He held the package firmly, but his face showed a mix of nervousness and determination. "I haven't cooked in years," he explained, almost in a whisper. "But after yesterday, I felt like I should try." Sarah carefully took the bundle from him, feeling the warmth emanating from it. Inside the cloth was a simple loaf of bread, but beautifully golden. It smelled of butter and honey, a scent that seemed to carry years of memories stored within. "I made the recipe Ellie always used," Mr. Miller continued, looking at his own hands. "It took me half the night to remember the right measurements. I didn't know if I'd still be able to, but here it is." Sarah couldn't hold back her smile. "Mr. Miller, this is wonderful. Please, come in. Let's try it together." He hesitated, but eventually nodded. Sarah guided him inside, where the warmth of the kitchen immediately surrounded him. Mr. Miller took off his hat, holding it in his hands as if it were a shield. Sarah grabbed a knife and gently cut the bread, placing 2 slices on plates decorated with Christmas motifs. As the aroma filled the room, they sat down at the table, side by side. Sarah took the first bite, closing her eyes for a moment to absorb the flavor. "It's delicious," she said, sincerely. "Ellie would have been very proud of you." Mr. Miller let out a small laugh, but there was something else in his eyes, something like relief, as if an old weight was beginning to dissipate. "You know," he said, while looking at the slice of bread in his hands, "I never thought I could feel this again. This warmth. It's so strange, because while it reminds me of her, it also makes me feel like there's still something ahead." Sarah placed her hand over his, with a gentle smile. "That's exactly how I felt when I started cooking Joe's recipes again. It's not about replacing the memories, but about finding space for them and for what's still to come." Mr. Miller nodded, looking at Sarah with what seemed like admiration. "You're a remarkable woman, Sarah," he said, simply. They ate the bread in silence for a while, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with mutual understanding. The sunlight began to pour through the window, lighting up the table and their faces as they shared the moment. After finishing, Sarah got up to grab the recipe book from the counter. "Now that you've remembered what it's like to cook," she said, with a sparkle in her eyes, "I think it's time to put you to work. We've got a long day of cookies ahead of us." Mr. Miller laughed, something more sincere this time. "I'm starting to think I've gotten myself into a bit of a jam." Sarah shook her head. "You've gotten yourself into the best jam possible. Now, let's see if your frosting skills are up to the challenge." As they began to gather the ingredients, something shifted in Sarah's house. It wasn't just the sound of pans or the shy laughter escaping between the two. It was the feeling that the spirit of Christmas, with all its magic and warmth, had returned to both of them, a shared gift neither of them had expected to receive. As the sun slowly rose in the sky, spilling golden light through the kitchen windows, Sarah and Mr. Miller found themselves in a shared rhythm. The ingredients were scattered across the counter, flour covering the surface, and even a little on Sarah's elbows, which she laughed at when she noticed the detail. "Well," she said, hands on her hips, "at least we know you're good with bread. Let's see how you do with gingerbread cookies." Mr. Miller looked at the open recipe book in front of him, his eyebrows furrowed as he read the instructions. "Do you really do this every year? It looks more complicated than I thought." Sarah shook her head, smiling. "It's not complicated, it's meticulous. You have to follow the process with patience, or the cookies won't turn out right. It's like life. One step at a time." He chuckled softly, something more genuine now, and began measuring the ingredients under Sarah's careful guidance. His hands were a bit shaky, but she noticed how much attention he paid to each movement, as if he wanted to honor Ellie's memory with his effort. "Remember," Sarah said, pointing to the bowl where he was mixing the dough, "don't overwork it. The cookies are better when they're treated with care." Mr. Miller stopped and looked at her, raising an eyebrow. "You talk as if these cookies were alive." Sarah shrugged, laughing. "Maybe they are, in a way. They carry stories, emotions, and if you do it right, they can touch someone's heart." They continued working together in comfortable silence, with only the sound of utensils and the faint clinking of pans. Sarah realized that, for the first time in a long while, her kitchen seemed full again, full of life, muffled laughter, and the kind of energy that only arises when two people share something meaningful. "Now comes the hardest part," Sarah said, after the dough was cut into perfect shapes and placed in the oven. "Hard?" Mr. Miller asked, drying his hands on a dish towel. "Decorating with icing," Sarah replied, handing him a piping bag. "This is where the real artists show what they know." Mr. Miller held the piping bag as if it were an unfamiliar instrument, studying it skeptically. "I'm sure Ellie would have laughed at me at this point, and she'd be right," Sarah said, winking, "but you'll do fine. It's all a matter of practice." When the cookies came out of the oven, golden and fragrant, Sarah carefully placed them on a rack to cool. She began demonstrating how to apply the icing, her experienced hands moving with precision. Each cookie received small snowflakes or hearts, while Mr. Miller watched attentively. "Now it's your turn," Sarah said, pushing the piping bag toward him. He hesitated, but finally took the bag and began to work. The first cookie was a disaster, with crooked lines and icing spilling down the sides. Sarah laughed, but not cruelly. It was the kind of laugh that encouraged, not discouraged. "It's not that bad," she said, although her eyes told a different story. "Oh, come on, Sarah," he responded, laughing too. "You know it's horrible." "It's horrible," she admitted, still laughing. "But you'll get better. Try again." The second cookie was considerably better, and the third, almost perfect. Gradually, Mr. Miller seemed to relax, until his hands moved with more confidence. "This is strangely therapeutic," he said, as he put the final touches on a star-shaped cookie. Sarah smiled. "It's because you're creating something that always does good for the soul." When they finished, the table was filled with beautifully decorated cookies. Mr. Miller looked at them with a mixture of pride and surprise. "You know," he said, "I never thought I'd do something like this again. I never imagined I'd have such a dedicated kitchen assistant," Sarah replied. "But look at us. We did it together." Mr. Miller looked at her, and for a moment, he said nothing. Finally, he smiled, a genuine smile full of gratitude. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, his voice slightly choked, "for all of this, for reminding me how it feels to be human again." Sarah lightly touched his arm, her gaze full of understanding. "We all need a little nudge now and then, Mr. Miller. You just needed to open the door." As the cookies cooled on the table and the kitchen was still filled with the scent of ginger and cinnamon, Sarah and Mr. Miller sat down again, each with a hot cup of tea in their hands. The warmth of the drink seemed more comforting than usual, not just because of the cold outside, but because of the company. "You know," Mr. Miller began, looking at the steam rising from his cup, "when you showed up at my door yesterday, I was so close to not opening it." Sarah smiled softly. "It wasn't a surprise, to be honest. I think I saw the door closing before you even decided to open it." He let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "It was easier, not letting anyone in. Because when you do, it means you have to remember and feel. And for a long time, that seemed unbearable." Sarah nodded, fully understanding what he meant. "I used to feel the same way," she replied. "After Joe passed, it seemed easier to pretend the world stopped with him. But the truth is, the world keeps going, even when we don't want it to." Mr. Miller lifted his gaze, meeting hers. "And what changed for you? How did you get out of that?" Sarah placed her cup down on the table, her fingers tracing the small designs on the porcelain glaze. "It was the little things," she said, after a moment. "I found his recipe book one day. It was tucked away at the back of the cupboard. I decided to make the fruitcake he loved, and as I mixed the ingredients, something happened. It was like he was there with me, like I could hear him laughing at the mess I made in the kitchen." She paused, her face lighting up with the memory. "From that moment, I realized it wasn't about forgetting. It was about finding a new way to keep the memories alive, to honor them, instead of letting them keep us trapped." Mr. Miller sat in silence for a while, absorbing her words. He seemed on the verge of saying something, but hesitated. "She did something like that," he finally said, his voice low. "Ellie had this way of putting love into everything she did. It wasn't just the food, but the details. The way she set the table, the way she decorated the plates. She used to say those little things mattered because they showed you cared." Sarah smiled. She was right. The small gestures speak louder than we think. Mr. Miller shook his head thoughtfully. "But I forgot that for so long. I was so caught up in the loss, in what I no longer had, that I didn't even realize there were still things worth living for. And yesterday," he paused, looking at Sarah with gratitude. "You reminded me of that, just by being there, by bringing that bread. It was like you lit a candle in a place where I hadn't seen light in years." Sarah felt her eyes well up, but she kept smiling. "Sometimes, all we need is a spark, Mr. Miller. Something small to remind us that life still has good moments to offer." He nodded, a small smile that seemed to grow with each passing second. "Well, it looks like you brought more than a spark. Those cookies might have saved my sanity." They both laughed together, and Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Genuine joy. Not the big, overwhelming kind of joy, but the quiet, deep kind that warms the heart in a subtle, lasting way. "Now," she said, setting her cup aside, "how about helping me pack these cookies into boxes for the neighbors? I'm sure they won't believe me when I tell them you helped make all of this." Mr. Miller's eyes widened in mock surprise. "Give them out? You didn't tell me you recruited me for a community project, Sarah." "Oh, of course I did," she replied, winking. "I just forgot to mention that part." He laughed. getting up from his chair. Well, I guess I can't refuse. But only because you're such a demanding supervisor. And don't you forget it, Sarah said, handing him a stack of small paper boxes decorated with red ribbons. As they packed the boxes together, Sarah's kitchen seemed full of life again. Laughter, conversation, and the sound of paper folding created an improvised melody that perfectly matched the Christmas spirit. You know, Mr. Miller said, tying a ribbon with a clumsy knot, I think Ellie would have loved to meet you. She always said Christmas was better when shared with people who really mattered. Sarah looked at him with a warm smile. I think I would have loved to meet her too. But, in a way, I feel like I know her. Because so much of what she left in you is still here. He paused for a moment, reflecting on her words, before nodding silently. Thank you, Sarah, for reminding me of that. As they finished the last box, Sarah looked out the window and saw the lights from the neighboring houses begin to glow in the approaching night. Outside, the world seemed so peaceful, so serene. But inside the small kitchen, there was something even more precious. When they finished packing the cookies, the kitchen was filled with small boxes decorated with red and green ribbons. Each one contained more than just sweets. It held gestures of affection and the hope for a warmer Christmas for whoever would receive them. Sarah looked at Mr. Miller, who was still holding one of the boxes, adjusting the ribbon with a hesitant knot. You're good at this, she said, laughing. If I'd known, I would have recruited you years ago. He let out a small laugh, but there was something more in his expression, a trace of uncertainty, as if he wasn't quite comfortable with everything that was happening. Sarah noticed the moment and decided to give him space to speak, if he wanted to. It's funny, he began. After a moment, I spent so many years avoiding people. Avoiding. All of this, he made a sweeping gesture with his hand, indicating the boxes, the kitchen, maybe even Christmas itself. And now, here I am, packing cookies like it's something I've always done. Sarah tilted her head, watching him with patience. And how do you feel about it? He took a deep breath, as if trying to gather his thoughts. It's different, he admitted. Good, but different. At the same time, there's this voice in my head asking me, what are you doing? Why do you care again? Sarah nodded slowly. It's normal. When we're used to protecting ourselves, opening the doors can feel strange, even scary. But sometimes, that's exactly what we need. To remember that we can still care. He looked at her, his eyes heavy with a mix of gratitude and vulnerability. I spent so much time trapped in this pain. I thought that if I kept away from everything, it wouldn't reach me. But I think I was wrong. You were, Sarah replied, her voice soft but firm. Pain never completely goes away. But when we allow it to mix with the good things, with the memories, with new moments, it becomes easier to carry. You're starting to do that now, Mr. Miller. You're finding balance. He sat in silence for a moment, processing her words. Finally, he placed the box he had been holding on the table and crossed his arms. I think Ellie knew that. She always knew. She never let her pain be bigger than the love she had for things. For people. She sounds like she was an extraordinary woman, Sarah said, with a warm smile. She was, he replied, his voice full of tenderness. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but full of meaning. Sarah knew that Mr. Miller was allowing himself to feel again, something he had likely avoided for years. She wanted to say more, but decided to let the moment breathe. After a few minutes, Mr. Miller looked up. And you, Sarah? How do you balance all of this? How do you keep caring even after everything you've been through? Sarah smiled softly, picking up one of the boxes and adjusting the ribbon, just like he had done. For me, it all comes back to the simple things. Like this recipe book, she said, pointing to the book on the counter. When I started cooking again, it wasn't just for me. It was to remember Joe, to honor what he meant. And somehow, that helped me remember that there was still beauty in life, even when it feels hard to see. She paused before continuing. And now, I see that in you. I see that, even though it's taken time, you're starting to make space for the good things again. Mr. Miller nodded slowly, a small smile touching his lips. I'm not sure if I'm ready for all of this yet, but I feel like I'm on the right path. That's all that matters, Sarah said. She picked up 2 of the boxes and handed one to him. "Now," she continued, slightly changing her tone, "let's see how your neighbors react to your cookies." "My cookies?" He raised an eyebrow, laughing. "You mean yours?" "Oh, no," Sarah replied, winking. "You helped, and I can guarantee you're getting all the credit today." As they prepared to leave, the night began to fall. The Christmas lights on the neighboring houses blinked softly, and the snow began to fall again, covering the streets with an ethereal glow. Sarah watched Mr. Miller hold his box with more confidence now, as if he were finally getting used to the idea of sharing something with others. As they walked down the street together, Sarah noticed that something had changed, not just for Mr. Miller, but for her too. The full kitchen, the shared laughter, the collaboration to create something simple but meaningful. All of it had reignited a spark in her that had long been fading. And at that moment, as they delivered the first box to a smiling neighbor, Sarah was sure that Christmas had fulfilled its promise to bring light, hope, and a powerful reminder that human connections are the greatest gift of all. The snow continued to fall gently, covering the neighborhood with an immaculate white blanket as Sarah and Mr. Miller walked down the street. The stack of cookie boxes in their hands grew smaller with each house they visited, but the impact of each delivery was palpable, not just on the neighbors' faces but also on Mr. Miller himself, who seemed lighter with each interaction. They stopped at the house of an elderly couple Sarah had known for years. The door was opened by a woman with white hair, holding a cane decorated with small Christmas ornaments. "Sarah, what a surprise," said the woman, her eyes lighting up as she saw her friend. "I'm not alone today, Mildred," Sarah said, gesturing to Mr. Miller, who was holding one of the boxes. Mildred's eyes widened as she recognized him. "Mr. Miller? My goodness, it's been so long. I thought we'd never see you around here again." He stepped forward, holding the box with firm hands, though there was still a hint of hesitation in his gaze. "It's true, it's been a long time," he admitted. "I think I've missed a lot more than I should have. But, well, Sarah here convinced me to come out of my shell. We brought cookies. Hope you like them." Mildred looked at him with a kind smile, taking the box. "Well, it's not just the cookies that matter, but the fact that you came. That's what makes all the difference." Mr. Miller nodded, murmuring a barely perceptible "thank you." They said their goodbyes, and as they walked to the next house, Sarah noticed he was more at ease, his steps less hesitant. "It wasn't so bad, was it?" she asked, with a playful smile. "No," he replied, looking down for a moment before lifting his eyes to meet hers. "Actually, it was good, really good." With each house they visited, Mr. Miller seemed to open up a little more. At the house of a young family, he handed the cookies directly to a small child, who looked up at him in awe and called him Santa Claus. Sarah laughed as she saw the blush rise on his cheeks, but Mr. Miller responded with a warm smile and a joke about needing a white beard to complete the disguise. By the time they reached the last house on the street, it was as if Mr. Miller had completely changed. He held the final box with confidence, rang the doorbell, and gave a genuine smile when a middle-aged couple opened the door. "We brought something special," he said, extending the box. The couple looked genuinely surprised and grateful. "Mr. Miller," said the man, shaking his hand, "it's so good to see you. We were wondering how you've been." Well," Mr. Miller replied, hesitating for a moment before continuing. "Actually, I'm starting to be well again. Merry Christmas to you." As they walked back to Sarah's house, Mr. Miller seemed taller, more present. The silence between them was comfortable, and Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment grow inside her. "You did great," she said, breaking the silence. He let out a short laugh. "You're a great coach. But, to be honest, this reminded me of something I hadn't realized in a long time." "What's that?" "That it's possible to care again. That there's still room for it," he said, looking at the snow ahead. "I spent so much time trying to avoid feeling anything that I forgot what it's like to be part of something." Sarah nodded, touched by his sincerity. "That's exactly it. No matter how hard we try to isolate ourselves, there will always be something pulling us back. And when we allow ourselves to, well, the world seems brighter, doesn't it?" "Yes," he replied, with a smile that seemed to light up his face. Back at Sarah's house, the kitchen welcomed them with a warm embrace. The candles were still lit, their flames casting soft shadows on the walls. Sarah prepared tea while Mr. Miller sat at the table, looking at the small details of the room. The photos, the decorations, the little touches that made Sarah's house feel like a home. "You have a talent for this," he said, gesturing to the decorated table. "For tea," Sarah joked. "For making everything human." "Warm," he replied, looking at her with gratitude. Sarah placed the cups of tea on the table and sat down, crossing her hands around the warm cup. "Well, I think you have that talent too, even if you forgot about it for a while." Mr. Miller was silent for a moment, looking at his cup. "Do you think Ellie would be proud of me today?" "I'm sure of it," Sarah replied without hesitation. She always believed in the power of small gestures, didn't she? And today, you turned them into something big. He nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "Thank you, Sarah, for not giving up on me. I didn't even know I needed this until you showed up at my door." "Sometimes all we need is a reminder," Sarah said softly. The clock on the wall marked 11:55, and Sarah looked at it with a smile. "See that? Almost midnight. Almost Christmas." Mr. Miller looked at the clock and then at her. "Merry Christmas, Sarah." "Merry Christmas, Mr. Miller," she replied. The kitchen fell silent again, but it was a silence full of life, hope, and the promise that, together, they had rediscovered what it meant to connect and care. Sarah's kitchen was brighter than ever, with the candles lit on the table and the Christmas tree lights softly twinkling in the corner of the room. The atmosphere was cozy, and the scent of the cookies still lingered in the air, mixed with the subtle perfume of freshly brewed tea. Mr. Miller looked around, absorbing every detail, as if trying to imprint the moment in his memory. "It's funny," he said, breaking the silence. "I spent so many years thinking I didn't need this, that I could live alone, with my memories, or with the lack of them. But now, sitting here, I don't know why it took me so long to realize what I was missing." Sarah smiled softly, resting her chin on her hands. "Sometimes, pain blinds us. We think we're protecting ourselves, but in reality, we're depriving ourselves of everything that can still bring us joy." Mr. Miller nodded, seeming to reflect on her words. He looked at the cup of tea in front of him, the steam rising in delicate spirals. "Today, when we delivered those boxes," he began, "each smile, each thank you. It was like I was starting to feel something I thought I had lost forever. Something Ellie always said, Christmas isn't about us. It's about what we do for others." Sarah felt the warmth of those words touch her heart. "Ellie was a wise woman," she said, with a smile. "She was," he replied, his voice full of tenderness. "And you are too, Sarah. You reminded me of what I was forgetting. What Ellie would never have let me forget." Sarah turned her gaze away for a moment, feeling the emotion rise in her chest. "Well, you reminded me of something too, Mr. Miller. You reminded me how good it is to have company, how good it is to share." The clock on the wall struck midnight. The kitchen felt even quieter, as if it were acknowledging the special moment. Sarah looked at the clock and then at Mr. Miller, who was watching her with a small smile. "Merry Christmas," he said, breaking the silence. "Merry Christmas," Sarah replied, with a sparkle in her eyes. After a few minutes of peaceful conversation, Mr. Miller looked at the Christmas tree in the corner of the room. "Do you always put up such a beautiful tree?" he asked, with a genuinely curious tone. "Every year," Sarah replied, leaning forward to admire the colorful lights. "Even when it seemed like no one but me would see it, I always thought it was important to keep that tradition." He nodded slowly, a smile forming on his lips. "Ellie and I always did it together. She would hang the ornaments, and I'd be in charge of the lights. She said I was more patient with the tangled wires." Sarah laughed, imagining the scene. "Sounds like a lovely partnership. Have you thought about putting up a tree again?" Mr. Miller sighed, thoughtfully. "Maybe this year is the start of something new," he said, with a hopeful tone. "I can help," Sarah offered. "I'm sure there's still time to find a tree, even if it's just a little pine. Let's decorate it together. Who knows, it might be the start of a new tradition." He was silent for a moment, his eyes full of emotion. Finally, he nodded, his smile widening. "I'd like that, Sarah. I'd really like that." With that promise in mind, they spent more time talking, sharing stories of past Christmases and plans for what was to come. Each word exchanged seemed to dissolve more of the weight they both carried, replacing it with something lighter, more hopeful. As Mr. Miller prepared to leave, Sarah walked him to the door. The snow was still falling outside, covering the street with a fresh, shining layer, reflecting the lights of the neighboring houses. "Thank you for today," he said, turning to her. "Not just for the cookies, but for everything. For reminding me that there are still good things in this world." Sarah placed a hand on his arm, smiling. "And thank you for opening your door. That's the hardest step, but also the most important." Mr. Miller gave a small nod before turning to leave. But as he reached the gate, he stopped and looked back. "Sarah," he called, his voice full of emotion. "Yes? Merry Christmas," he said, with a smile that seemed to light up the night. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Miller," she replied, watching him slowly disappear into the snow. Closing the door, Sarah stood still for a moment, the kitchen silent around her. But this time, the silence wasn't empty. It was full of promises, of new beginnings, of connections, and of a brighter future. As she blew out the candles and climbed the stairs, Sarah thought about how far they had come in just 2 days. And she knew, with complete certainty, that Christmas had returned to be exactly what it should be. A time of hope, healing, and shared love. The next morning, Sarah woke to the soft sunlight streaming through her bedroom window. The snow outside reflected the brightness, filling the house with a subtle warmth that seemed to echo the renewed joy in her heart. She descended the stairs slowly but steadily, feeling the familiar smell of coffee she had brewed the night before. As she poured herself a cup, she looked out the window and noticed something that made her pause. At Mr. Miller's house, there was movement. For the first time in years, the curtains were open, and even more surprisingly, a small Christmas tree was visible in the living room, decorated with softly blinking lights. Sarah smiled to herself as she held the cup with both hands, allowing the warmth to envelop her. She knew something had changed. Later that morning, while Sarah was finishing washing the breakfast dishes, she heard a soft knock at the door. When she opened it, she found Mr. Miller standing there, wearing his thick coat and holding a brown paper bag. "Good morning, Sarah," he said, with a shy smile. "Good morning, Mr. Miller. What a pleasant surprise." He handed her the bag. "I wanted to return the favor. It's not much, but I thought it was the least I could do." Sarah carefully took the bag and looked inside. There were 2 homemade loaves of bread, wrapped in a simple but beautiful cloth. The scent of butter and herbs wafted out, warming the cold air between them. "Mr. Miller," she said, looking at him with gratitude. "This is wonderful, but you've already done so much just by opening your door. This bread is an extra gift." He shook his head, smiling. "No, Sarah, you've done so much. More than you know." She invited him in, and together, they sat back down at the kitchen table. The conversation flowed more easily now, like old friends catching up. Mr. Miller talked about the previous night, about how he had decorated the tree alone, but feeling accompanied by Ellie's memories and Sarah's words. "It was strange, you know," he said, with a brief laugh. "At first, it felt wrong, like I was betraying what I felt for her. But then I realized, it's not about replacing her. It's about honoring her, like you said." Sarah nodded, her eyes shining. "Exactly. And now you're creating something new. Something she would have loved." Mr. Miller looked out the window, watching the snowflakes fall from the gray sky. "I still have a lot to learn, but I feel like I'm on the right path. And that, Sarah, is because of you. Don't underestimate the role you've played in this, Mr. Miller," she replied, placing her hand on the table. "Opening your door was the greatest gesture of all." Throughout the day, Sarah and Mr. Miller visited more neighbors to deliver cookies and bread. Each interaction seemed more natural for him, who now exchanged smiles and even a few jokes with people who had only known him as the reclusive man from the dark house. When they returned to Sarah's house later in the afternoon, the kitchen was warm again, and the table was full of gifts received from the neighbors. Small cakes, Christmas cards, and even a bottle of wine. Mr. Miller looked at the table and shook his head, amazed. "I never would have imagined this 2 days ago. It feels like a miracle." "The best miracles are like that," Sarah replied, laughing softly. They happen when we least expect them, but exactly when we need them. They shared one last cup of tea before Mr. Miller got up to leave. He looked around the kitchen, as if wanting to take in every detail. "Sarah," he said, stopping at the door. "I just wanted to say, this Christmas will be one of the most special I've ever had. And that's because of you." Sarah placed a hand on his arm, smiling warmly. "It's special for me too. And I'm sure Joe and Ellie are both proud of us." Mr. Miller smiled, and for a moment, they both stood in silence, sharing a connection that words couldn't describe. As he walked through the snow toward his house, Sarah felt a wave of gratitude so overwhelming it almost made her cry. It wasn't just for him, but for what they had both found. A rebirth, a renewed purpose, and a reminder that, no matter how difficult life may seem, there's always a way back to the light. Closing the door, Sarah turned to the kitchen, full of life and warmth. Christmas had finally regained its meaning, and she knew that, from here on out, everything would be different for her, for Mr. Miller, and for everyone who had been touched by that simple act of shared generosity. The snow was falling outside, soft and steady, covering the world with a tranquility that mirrored Sarah's state of mind. Her kitchen, still warmed by the activities of the day, was now silent. Only the occasional sound of wind tapping against the windows broke the calm. Sarah picked up the recipe book that was resting on the counter and opened it carefully, running her fingers over the pages, which bore marks of use, flour stains, small notes in faded ink, and scribbles from years ago made by her grandchildren. Each page seemed to tell a story. She paused on the gingerbread cookie recipe. It was one of the oldest in the book, written in her mother's handwriting. There was something comforting about that page, as if her mother's voice could be heard in every word. "Mix with patience," read a note in the corner, "and don't forget to decorate with love." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, letting the memories flood in. She thought of Mr. Miller, the words he had said that morning about Ellie, and how he had described the feeling of rediscovering something he thought he had lost. It had touched Sarah deeply because she knew exactly what he meant. She remembered her own healing process, how opening the recipe book for the first time after losing Joe had been an act of courage. Back then, each recipe seemed like a painful reminder of what she had lost. But over time, she realized that they were also a way to keep him close, to keep alive the connection to the happy memories they shared. While she was tidying up the dinner dishes, she heard a soft knock at the door. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and went to the entrance, wondering who it could be so late. When she opened the door, she saw Nancy, her neighbor, with a cake carefully covered in her hands. "I knocked, but I think you were distracted," Nancy said, walking in with a warm smile. "I hope you don't mind the surprise visit." "Not at all," Sarah replied, holding the door open as Nancy stepped inside. "What a lovely surprise. What brings you here at this hour?" Nancy placed the cake on the table and looked around the kitchen. "I heard you and Mr. Miller were spreading joy today," she said with a playful tone. "I thought I should return the favor. This is my famous fruitcake. No one but me likes it, but I insist on making it every Christmas." Sarah laughed, pulling out a chair for Nancy to sit. "Well, I'll be the judge of that. I think I have a good track record with cakes, you know." Nancy laughed too and sat down, resting her elbows on the table as she watched Sarah gather plates and utensils. "Seriously, Sarah," she said, "it was amazing to see Mr. Miller today. I never thought I'd see him so cheerful. What did you do for him? What's your secret?" Sarah placed 2 slices of cake on the plates and sat next to Nancy, pausing for a moment before answering. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," she said finally. "I just saw something in him that I knew well. The pain of losing someone and the fear of letting the world in again. When you feel that, you know how hard it can be. But you also know how important it is for someone to be there, not to give up on you." Nancy nodded thoughtfully. "You know," she said, stirring her plate's edge, "I always thought he was a lost cause. But maybe no one tried hard enough." Sarah looked at Nancy, her smile calm. "Maybe he just needed a little push. Sometimes, all we need is someone to remind us that there's still something good waiting for us." "You're a special person, Sarah," said Nancy, lightly touching her hand. "I'm sure Joe would be very proud of you." Nancy's words struck Sarah deeply, and she felt her eyes well up. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "But I think it wasn't just Mr. Miller who changed today. He reminded me of something important too, that it's never too late to open your heart again." The two of them sat in silence for a moment, savoring the cake as the wind outside whistled softly. Nancy finally got up, promising to come back the next day to help organize things. Sarah thanked her, feeling deeply grateful to have such a thoughtful neighbor. After Nancy left, Sarah returned to the recipe book. She opened it again to the gingerbread cookie page and stared at the notes made over the years. Smiling, she took a piece of paper and a pen. She wrote slowly, carefully choosing each word. For all those who believe that memories can be recreated, and that the magic of Christmas lies in the little gestures. May these recipes bring warmth and connection to your hearts. Sarah placed the dedication on the first page of the book and closed it, holding it for a moment before placing it back on the counter. That book was more than just a recipe book. It was a testament to her journey, to how the simplest things, like a plate of cookies, could carry the greatest lessons. As she made tea to end the evening, she heard laughter coming from Mr. Miller's house. Intrigued, she went to the window. He was in the living room, with two neighbors and his little decorated Christmas tree glowing in the background. The sound of laughter and happy voices mixed with the soft glow of the lights, creating a scene that Sarah knew she would never forget. She stood there for a moment, watching, feeling her heart fill with something she hadn't felt completely in a long time: gratitude. Not just for what she had done, but for what she had received in return. A powerful reminder that it's never too late to start over. Closing the curtains and heading upstairs to bed, Sarah took one last look at the recipe book on the counter and smiled. This Christmas wasn't just special, it was a starting point. The next morning, Sarah was awoken by the soft sound of wind chimes swaying on the porch. The sunlight reflected off the fresh snow outside, covering the neighborhood with a nearly magical glow. When she descended the stairs, there was already activity in the street. Children were playing with makeshift sleds, and neighbors waved to each other with warm smiles. It was as if something had shifted in that small community, something that went beyond the season's cold and the Christmas decorations. There was a sense of connection that hadn't been present before, a shared spirit that seemed to have been reignited. Sarah was preparing coffee when she heard a light knock at the door. When she opened it, she found a group of neighbors gathered, each holding something in their hands: cakes, breads, and even a wreath of fresh flowers. "Sarah," said Nancy, who was leading the group, holding a dish covered with aluminum foil. "We thought it was time to give back a little of what you and Mr. Miller did for us yesterday." Sarah looked at the group, surprised and moved. "Oh, this wasn't necessary. But what a wonderful gesture. You brought Christmas back to all of us," said one of the neighbors, a gray-haired lady named Marjorie. "It's been years since the street felt so alive. I think we all realized how important the little gestures are." They entered, filling Sarah's kitchen with vibrant energy. Nancy quickly organized the dishes on the table while the other neighbors exchanged stories about the previous day, how the cookies had touched their families and how even the most reserved neighbors had smiled. As she listened, Sarah realized how that simple act of sharing cookies had grown, like a circle expanding and reaching more and more people. "And Mr. Miller?" asked Nancy. "He seems like a new man." Sarah chuckled softly. "I think he's just beginning to rediscover what it means to connect. And honestly, he gave us just as much as we gave him." "Well, maybe we should include him in this impromptu breakfast," said Marjorie. Sarah nodded, grabbing her coat. "Give me a minute. I'll invite him." Crossing the street, Sarah saw the small Christmas tree glowing in the window of Mr. Miller's house. She knocked on the door, hearing quick footsteps, and within seconds, he opened it, looking more excited than ever. "Sarah," he said, with a warm smile. "What a surprise." "It's you who should be surprised," she said. "The neighbors are in my kitchen, and they insisted I come invite you. We're having an impromptu breakfast." Mr. Miller hesitated for a moment, but then smiled and grabbed his coat. "Well, I guess I can't refuse, can I? Especially after everything that happened yesterday." "Not a chance," Sarah said, laughing. Back in Sarah's kitchen, Mr. Miller was greeted with enthusiasm, something that visibly moved him. He was guided to the table by Nancy, who didn't waste time serving him a generous slice of cake. As breakfast continued, Sarah observed the interaction between her neighbors and Mr. Miller. He was talking, laughing, and even telling stories about Ellie and the Christmases they had shared. It was as if the shadow of isolation that had surrounded him had finally dissipated. Marjorie raised a cup of coffee. "To Mr. Miller," she said, smiling, "and to the fresh start we all deserve." The others raised their cups too, and Sarah felt a wave of emotion as she saw how that simple act of unity had grown and touched so many lives. Later, when the neighbors left and the kitchen returned to its usual silence, Mr. Miller stayed behind to help Sarah clean up. They worked side by side, in comfortable silence, until the last cup was put away. Before leaving, he stopped at the door, holding the doorknob. "Sarah," he said, looking at her with sincerity, "I'll never be able to thank you enough for what you did. Not just for me, but for all of us." She smiled, gently touching his arm. "You don't need to thank me. Just keep doing what you started. And remember, you brought something special to all of us too." Mr. Miller nodded, his smile lighting up the room. "Well," he said, joking, "I guess I'll have to start preparing for next Christmas. Looks like I've got a reputation to uphold now." Sarah laughed, waving as he walked back home. When she closed the door, she looked out the window again. The street was full of life, with children playing and neighbors chatting happily. It was a sight that filled her heart with warmth and gratitude. As night fell, the street was alive in a way Sarah hadn't seen in years. Christmas lights twinkled on every house, and laughter echoed through open windows. There was a tangible warmth in the air, not just because of the decorations or the festivities, but something deeper, a spirit of togetherness that seemed to have been reborn. Sitting in her armchair, Sarah watched the Christmas tree sparkling in the corner of the room. Its ornaments, carefully stored over the years, reflected the colorful lights, and each one carried a special memory. As she sipped her tea, she thought about everything this Christmas had brought. She glanced out the window toward Mr. Miller's house. His little tree was still glowing in the living room, and his figure was visible through the open curtains. He was sitting in his armchair, reading, while the tree's light cast soft shadows across the room. It was a simple sight, but one full of meaning. A man who had finally found his way back to life. The phone rang, breaking the silence. Sarah answered with a smile, already imagining who it could be. "Aunt Sarah," said Jenny's cheerful voice on the other end of the line. "I heard that you and Mr. Miller transformed the neighborhood's Christmas. It seems like the whole street is talking about it." Sarah laughed, leaning back in her chair. "We didn't do anything so grand, dear. We just reminded everyone of what they already knew. Christmas isn't about big gestures. It's about the little moments that warm the heart." "Well, it seems like you did a great job," Jenny said, with admiration. "And how are you feeling?" Sarah looked at the tree, the light reflecting in her eyes. "I feel whole. This Christmas was special, Jenny. Not because something extraordinary happened, but because there was something real, something that reminded us that it's never too late to start over. You always know how to find the magic in simple things," Jenny replied, fondly. After the call ended, Sarah remained sitting, reflecting. She grabbed the recipe book that was on the table next to her and opened it to any random page. Her mother's and Joe's notes seemed to come alive under the tree's light, reminding her of how traditions can be an anchor in times of change. The story of this Christmas, of how a plate of cookies brought Mr. Miller back to the community and reignited his heart, was more than a lesson. It was a testament to the power of small gestures. Sarah smiled to herself, feeling the flame of a renewed purpose. As the night went on, she knew that this Christmas would be remembered, not just by her and Mr. Miller, but by the whole neighborhood. Christmas morning dawned bright and clear. The sun reflected off the fresh snow, covering the street with an ethereal glow that seemed straight out of a dream. Sarah was in the kitchen, preparing a hot coffee when she heard the sound of footsteps approaching the door. When she opened it, she found Mr. Miller holding a small basket decorated with red and green ribbons. He looked different, not just because of the wider smile on his face, but the lightness in his posture. "Merry Christmas, Sarah," he said, extending the basket. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Miller," she replied, taking the basket and peeking inside. There were freshly baked cookies, perfectly shaped, with decorated icing that showed the care put into each one. "I decided it was time to try again," he said, laughing. "I hope these live up to the standard." Sarah laughed, admiring the work. "They're beautiful. I think you learned very well." "I had a good teacher," he replied, with a sincere tone. Sarah invited him in, and they sat at the table, sharing coffee and cookies while discussing their plans for the day. He mentioned that he had received dinner invitations from several neighbors, something he never imagined he'd accept before that Christmas. "And you?" he asked. "Any special plans for today?" Sarah smiled softly. "I think I've had everything I needed this year. This Christmas gave me more than I could have expected." They sat in silence for a moment, but it was a comfortable silence, full of mutual understanding. Sarah's Christmas tree sparkled in the room next door, casting a soft light over the kitchen, while the aroma of the cookies filled the air. "Sarah," Mr. Miller began, his voice quieter, "I just wanted to say thank you. You reminded me of something I had forgotten long ago. How good it feels to be part of something, to truly be present." Sarah touched his hand on the table, smiling. "You reminded me of that too. And that's what makes Christmas so special. It's not about what we have or what we've lost, but about what we share." That night, as Sarah prepared to sleep, she looked once more at the small pile of leftover cookie boxes. Each one carried a simple message: love, care, and connection. She thought about the years she had spent alone, trying to find purpose after Joe passed. This Christmas had been different because she allowed herself to do something small, but meaningful, to open a door, both literally and figuratively. Before turning off the light, Sarah looked out the window. Across the street, the lights on Mr. Miller's tree still twinkled softly, a reminder that the transformation was just beginning. Just as Sarah and Mr. Miller discovered, the simplest moments can carry the greatest meanings. This Christmas, you too can create new traditions, share love, and warm the hearts around you. In the pinned comment, you will find the link to the ebook Sweet Christmas Memories. Simple recipes to warm the soul. This ebook is not just a collection of recipes. It's a celebration of the simple gestures that make Christmas special. It's filled with ideas to help you create magical moments and memories that will last forever. Click the link in the pinned comment and let the Christmas spirit transform your home. Don't miss any videos. Subscribe now and let us know what you thought of this video in the comments.